The first two films in this series presented artifacts, books, and maps from the 15th to 17th century that attest to the fact that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built no earlier than the 17th century. The topic of this film is the technology used to construct these pyramids. The conventional view regarding their construction concentrates on the problem of delivering enormous stone blocks to the construction site from a distant quarry, as well as the method of lifting them onto the pyramid, for instance, with the aid of a ramp created by piling up sand. Supposedly, dozens of slaves dragged ropes attached to cedar sleds carrying multi-ton stone blocks. But why go to such lengths? Was there really no other simpler and more technological way of delivering the blocks to the pyramid construction site? In the second half of the 18th century, Syria and Egypt were visited by Constantin Francois de Volney, a French educator, philosopher, Orientalist, and politician. His book, in which he describes his voyage, was published in several European languages, including Russian. This is what he writes about the possible method of construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza. At the beginning of this century, it was thought that the material was brought from a different place according to Herodotus' account. But when the travelers noticed the similarity between both types of stones, they concluded that it was all extracted from the foundation of those very mountains. And now, Herodotus' account is taken as a sort of fairy tale, and the stones supposedly brought from afar are rejected as rather wrong-headed. It is supposed that the leveling of the rocky mountain could have delivered the majority of those stones in the pyramid, and any deficit was then supplemented from underground passageways in the pyramids themselves, where as many stones as necessary could be removed. Volney saw what modern Egyptologists don't see or don't want to see. The pyramids stand atop the foundations of limestone mountains, which were used to obtain the blocks for their own, the pyramids, construction. Today, the space between the pyramids is covered with sand. Perhaps it was even brought here on purpose, so that it would not be apparent that each of the three Great Pyramids was once a separate mountain. This engraving by the Dutch artist and engraver Jan Caspar Philips is dated 1733. Up until the mid-17th century, or even later, such limestone mountains stood in the environments of Giza. This is the White Mountain, or Akkaya Mountain, in Crimea, and on top of them stood sharp-pointed pyramids, much like those in Nubia in today's Sudan. These blocks weren't lifted. This is a false supposition by Egyptologists, which has led modern scientists, engineers, and other scholars into a dead end. Instead, they were lowered down from the mountain that served as the source of the building materials. In other words, a mountain was transformed into a pyramid. Old pyramids were taken apart and put to use as well. Volney further writes about the pyramid blocks. It is incredible that they were moved from far-flung places because the expenses, which must have been excessively high, would have multiplied even further. Volney does not stick to the official version of the pyramid's construction because it doesn't correspond at all with what he saw with his own eyes. It's easy to become convinced that the Great Pyramid of Giza is a limestone mountain covered with stone blocks on the outside by looking inside the pyramid. This is the passage from the large gallery to the Queen's chamber, and its walls, floors, and ceiling consist of a carved-out mountain, and there are no blocks here at all. The location of this enclosure is marked with an arrow, and it is much higher than the level of the mountain rocks on this official plan of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And this is the large gallery itself, where supposed junctions are carved between supposed blocks. But such neat junctions between stone blocks don't exist, not even in our time. Here is another example of such carved lines indicating granite blocks, in air quotes, perfectly aligned. In reality, these are not granite blocks, but rather granite plaster made to look like natural granite. The relief of the top block continues the curvatures of the bottom rock. The probability of such a coincidence is negligibly small. And now, perhaps the most tangible proof that the blocks in this tunnel aren't real, but rather drawn or rather carved, are their vertical junctions. Usually, stones are not aligned in such a way that their vertical junctions would match up with the vertical junctions of adjacent rows of stones. Furthermore, one normally tries to lay the stones in such a way that the top block would cover two lower blocks. That's how the wall's solidity is achieved. Here, instead, we see a simply stunning sight. Not only are the blocks perfectly aligned with each other, but their vertical junctions match up with the vertical junctions of the row above. And they were aligned without any mortar, which is even more difficult. It's as though instead of a huge stone block being laid here, a sheet of notebook paper was grid drawn with a ruler. Okay, suppose the Egyptologists are pulling our legs with these blocks. But in that case, how were the huge granite blocks delivered to the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza, when the largest of the blocks reaches 35 tons or even 60 tons, according to some estimates? First of all, we need to establish, based on the fake carved stone blocks, that the mountain rock inside the pyramid is significantly higher than it is officially considered to be. Second, the Egyptians, and not just Egyptians, in the 17th and 18th century, knew the secret of creating artificial granite. This is a column from one of the temples in Baalbek, and it is also not as ancient as historians believe. We will talk about Baalbek separately. This is what artificial granite looks like in the Temple of Khafre, next to the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Egyptians, or those who passed themselves off as ancient Egyptians, also knew what granite plaster was. And third, shaping a sarcophagus and the walls of the king's chamber out of artificial granite, as though out of plasticine right on site, using a sharp form or a special mold that's no longer 60 tons of unbearable weight. Rather, it would have been regular sacks or baskets of granite grit, a product of the natural decay of granite, or granite chips, plus a secret alkaline solution from granite craftsmen, in which the quartz sand, a component of granite, dissolves to become liquid glass, and after adding the grit to this mixture, it was only necessary to wait for the mixture to fully solidify in the casing or mold. The artificial granite obtained in this way was practically indistinguishable from natural granite, even in its chemical makeup. By the way, Egypt has plenty of natural alkali in the form of a salt called natron, as well as granite grit for the production of artificial granite on an industrial scale. In his monograph on the structure of the Upper Nile Valley deposits, Soviet geologist Ivan Sergeyevich Jumakov mentions grit as a product of the natural breakdown of granite 19 times. So we have addressed the unbearably heavy granite blocks of the ancient Egyptians. All that remains is to figure out how the Egyptians managed the external multi-ton blocks. But there is no mystery here either. If we immediately discard the fantastical official hypothesis that the Egyptians dragged these huge rocks from afar in some unknown way, and hold instead to the more elegant, logical supposition that they took them right from the construction site, chipping ready-made construction material off the limestone mountains and hills. This is the best-known, most famous quarry in the world, not far from the Italian city of Carrara, whose name comes from the Celtic word for quarry. It is possible that the name of Cairo also comes from the European word for quarry, especially considering that the Arabic etymology of this word is very odd and most likely contrived. Since the time of Michelangelo, the great sculptor and artist took marble right from his quarry, people have learned to separate multi-ton boulders from the rock and to lower them down to the foot of a mountain, and then to transport them to the worksite. From the 15th to the 19th century, when these photos were taken, the technique of obtaining stone blocks has undergone practically no changes. So there is nothing fantastical here. Long before the construction of the Great Pyramids, people knew not only how to separate multi-ton stone blocks from the mountains, but also how to move them across significant distances. And, as Archimedes used to say, "Give me a lever, and I will lift the earth." In the next film, we will explain how the ancient Egyptians, or those that historians pass off as ancient Egyptians, were able to orient the Great Pyramids of Giza strictly to the north without using modern navigation devices.